When we talk about foraging, the honeybee and their foraging. Thank you, Al. That's what I want, right there. When we talk about the honeybee and them foraging, nectar is the primary target for their foraging process. So flower blooms, tree blooming, dogwoods, apple, peach, etc. All of those are really critical pieces. This brother was telling me that they had several apple trees on their place. That's awesome. The thing to remember about blooming season is that apple trees have a very short window of bloom. Peach trees have a short window of bloom. So things like that are great, but the timeline is critically important to realize. Some of the greatest forage sources in this part of the world is like white clover. White clover is a really good source. Yellow low hop clover is a great source. Red clover has a little bit of a tendency to be a little more of a challenge because the nectar is so deep into that bloom. That red clover has to be cut about 3 times, like if it's a hay source, has to be cut about 3 times before that honeybee can actually work that bloom. Alfalfa is great, soybean blooms are great. So all of that stuff you want to take into consideration. If you have flowerings that exist all the time, like around your property, the more blooming periods that you can pull, the better it is for the honeybees, okay? The longevity of it is real critical to recognize and realize throughout your foraging process.
A question about that clover. And crimson clover is different than red clover, right?
It is.
Okay, so crimson clover is better?
Crimson clover should be a good, and crimson clover is a winter clover. Isn't that right?
I'm not sure about the crimson.
I think there's 2 clovers that are winter clovers. I need to look at that and make sure, but crimson clover is a good source. White clover and yellow clover. Sweet clover is great. It's a biennial, but it's a little challenging to raise in this part of the world just because of our weather conditions. White clover is what we commonly see everywhere. I've got buddies that have white clover all over their yard and they won't mow their yard because they raise bees. But you know, when you get into these subdivisions, nobody wants white clover in their yard. So these lawn guys and landscape guys, they're constantly killing it. It's tragic because the honeybee depends on that product as a food source in a great order in this neck of the woods. So anything you can do with your fields or your property to establish, well, the thing about white clover, and the reason I kind of stress it is because it's a perennial. It'll come back every year. From now till Juvember, it'll come back every year. Where a lot of other clovers, red clover is a 2-year, sweet clover is a 2-year, you have to keep replanting. Low hop clover, you can't even buy seed for it. It's a natural in the wild. It's basically a Missouri native. Wildflowers are great as well, so you can go on you can go on the website or you can go Google Missouri native flowers. A lot of those are great. Yes, sir.
Also, the library will, if you've got a library card and you go there, they'll give you 3 packets of wildflower seeds, native Missouri wildflower seeds per library card. So
there you go.
You and the kids can all get 3 packets apiece.
Nice. So those things have great survival rate in the state. Yes, sir.
So like in the summertime, back when I was a kid, we got done eating watermelon, throw it out by the barn, and then later you could see it's just full of honeybees.
Right.
We found years later an old abandoned house that was full. They got over 100 gallons of honey out of the house. That's where they were coming from, but that's why I guess when we threw that watermelon, right? So is it okay to do that, or are they getting?
Absolutely. They'll feed on those sweet juices. And yeah, watermelon honey is really, really almost looks like clear water. I mean, it's real light and really good. Yeah, they'll work the watermelon bloom. They'll also work the fruit if you happen to leave watermelon, and you know how it'll begin to rot or open up. If it's left too long, they'll feed on that. Yeah, feed them the watermelon rinds. That's awesome. Cantaloupe, same way. That's his hand. Okay, so Nectar is the main source that they're actually looking for. The pollen is important to feed the brood. The propolis is important to seal the hive, but nectar is the main source of what they're looking for, and that's why the bloom period within our plant life is so important. What they're looking for is 3 important sugars in nectar, and this is what you're going to find: fructose, glucose, and sucrose, all 3. So your honey, it's stored as honey. That's what you're eating when you eat honey. Raw honey is those 3 sources of carbohydrates. Protein, pollen is the source they use for protein to feed their young. It's their brood food. And then propolis, of course, we say, is sap from the trees, and that's what they use to protect the hive and seal up the hive. Now, one thing that I don't know why I went brain dead a while ago, but what's critical in this hive is the communication source. Remember me telling you that part of the responsibility of the worker bee was you had foraging bees, scout bees looking for forage all the time. So when the scout bees find a forage source, they come back to the hive and they communicate the presence, the direction, the distance, and the nutritional strength of the nectar and pollen sources that they have found, and they communicate it back to the hive. There are 2 communication methods that they use. One is called a round dance, where they literally will work in a circle. They'll go in a circle, dance in a circle, then they'll go reverse into clockwise. And they do it in conjunction with the arc of the sun and the direction of the forage. That's how the bees know. So by the arc of the sun, the direction of the forage, they communicate that to the hive. The round dance indicates to the hive that the forage is close proximity to the hive. And I think I saw somewhere where it was, I better not do that, 250 feet or less, the forage source. That's what the prerequisite is for the round dance in the hive, that source of communication. The other dance that they do is called the waggle dance. They are to really make this a dance for the streets, I'll tell you. I mean, I don't know why you couldn't go to a dance club and make this. It's typically a figure-8 pattern, and they'll start at a semicircle, half. They'll do a half moon semicircle, they'll do a straight line, and then they'll do a reverse half moon semicircle and join back to the existing first semicircle. What that does, and in the same measure, it's correlated with the arc of the sun and the distance, or the direction of the forage. That's how the worker bees know where to go, which way to go to find it. The waggle dance represents the farther distance away for the bees. And that bee that's doing the waggle dance, he'll thump his stomach and make all kinds of noise, and that's the way they communicate to the hive that this is where the forage source is, this is the direction to go in respect to the sun, the movement of the sun or the direction of the sun, and this is where you'll find it. So it's pretty fascinating to watch that. And you will, in your experience, find the opportunity to see that actually transpiring in your hive. It's funny and fascinating to watch the bees do a waggle dance.
Do they do that on the frame?
They'll do it on the frame. Yep. And you'll get to see it happen. I mean, I've actually got to witness it a couple of times. It's pretty phenomenal to watch, especially if you know what's going on and you know why. Look at them bees. They're just doing a figure-8. Oh, yeah, that's the waggle dance. They're telling this hive that the source is this direction, and they're telling this hive the distance of. And the distance, I think, is helped determined by the size of the figure-8 they do on that frame. So it tells them in closer proximity or farther proximity. So the scout bee is pretty critical to the existence of the hive, wouldn't you say? The communication process is pretty fantastic, and it's a lot of fun to see. The other thing that's important to recognize about your hive is weather conditions. And we briefly touched on this last week. I do not want in my hive if it's below 60 degrees for sure. I have seen guys try it at 50 and 55, but it makes me nervous. Remember, your brood needs to stay at the degree of 88 to 95 degrees. So when I open up this hive, I'm exposing that brood to cooler temperatures, which can challenge the life of that cell, that egg cell, that egg. So I'm trying to be protective of that. I do not like to see real windy conditions when I'm in the hive, because the more air movement inside that hive, the more it takes away from the warmth that they're creating in that hive for the existence of the brood. So if I've got a nice calm day and it's 65, 70, ideally 75 to 80 degrees, those are the ideal conditions. I feel good about opening up my hive and working that hive. I also want to look at the weather patterns. If there is a storm coming, if they're predicting storms tonight or this afternoon, I mean, my personal preference is to work my bees early in the morning if I can. I like the cool of the morning a lot better, especially in midsummer when it gets so hot in the afternoon, because you will sweat profusely in the middle of a July afternoon. So if I can get into the mornings, the bees seem calmer. They probably haven't had their coffee or caffeine yet, so they're a little more relaxed, and I'm feeling good about where I'm at. So if they're predicting a storm front coming in, the bees are great. They know barometers. They're really good with that. They'll be a little more testy. They don't want you in there mixing or messing with them. I don't do it on rainy days, obviously. I don't want any moisture in my hive. And certainly if I've got a weather condition or a pattern coming in, I try to safeguard that. If you weren't here last week, I will repeat this for your benefit. If you go to your beehive, do not wear cologne. I'd be careful with my hairspray. You don't have to put your makeup on, and you don't have to doll up for them. They don't mind you coming just like you got out of bed in your PJs. If you want to, that's fine. But be real careful with cologne, because it will set them off, or it'll attract them to you in a way that you probably would prefer they didn't. Don't eat bananas. Bananas are a very offensive smell to the bee, and if you happen to smoke, be very wise with that, because smoke is a very offensive smell to them as well. Any questions? Yes, sir.
So, talking about the scent, like a bloodhound, they say every human's got their own scent.
That's right.
The bloodhound picks up on it.
Yep.
And an example is people that eat a lot of garlic. You can just walk in the room and like somebody's in this room that eats garlic. Can the bees actually pick up on your scent?
Absolutely.
And they get used to it, like, oh,
Yep.
we know this guy's here working
Yep.
with us and everything. And a stranger puts on your gear and walks up to the hive,
They'll react different.
they will react.
Yeah. So your bees will get used to you. When I work my bees, I am very gentle and very deliberate. I think through what I want to accomplish before I open that hive, and then I move accordingly. I don't want to be in that hive, or I don't want that hive opened up no longer than necessary. Okay? Every time you open the hive, it does disrupt the social order of the hive. But think about what you want to do or you need to do, and have that process going, and be very quiet, very deliberate, and very direct in what you're doing. We had a beekeeping class. I went to West Plains, Missouri, and taught a beekeeping class a few years ago for the economic development organization down there. And the director of the organization thought she was a beekeeper. She had a couple of hives at her house, and we were going to do a live inspection with her hives at the house. It was an overcast day. They were predicting rain, and I kept telling her, I said, this is not going to be the best day to do this. I said, these bees are going to be testy, and you've got a bunch of new beekeepers here. It's going to make a bad impression. I said, I really want you to rethink this. It'll be okay. It'll be okay. It'll be okay. She kept persisting, so I said, okay. So we go down to this hive. This is the honest truth. She goes to bouncing on this hive, breaking this lid off, and I'm like, don't do that. I mean, literally, she was just pecking on the hive, bouncing on it, and man, these bees started rolling out of that hive, and I'm like, Oh my geez, they were hotter than a pistol. When we got that hive open, they were mad. And these new beekeepers, I never felt so sorry. My dad and my brother-in-law was standing back watching. They didn't have their bee suits on. They were way across the yard, and they left and went to the car. And new beekeepers, if you have long hair, make sure your hair is up in your veil. If a bee gets tangled in your hair, they panic, and you'll panic with them because you think they're going to sting you. They're trying to get away, but you'll go to grabbing at them and you'll wind up getting stung. So you don't want them in your hair. Even mine, with all the hairspray I've got on, they'll get in my hair and they'll mess it up bad, and I'll get nervous about it. These bees, there was a poor lady there that had long hair, and she had a cap and a part of a veil on, but her hair was out of the side, somehow out of her veil. They covered that poor lady up. I felt so sorry for her. And I got so frustrated with that coordinator because exactly what I told her transpired, and these new beekeepers had a horrible experience their first time into a live hive. So it's just a few precautions to protect you and to make your experience a lot more pleasurable. Take safeguard. Be real gentle and very deliberate. I mean, when you pull a frame out, pull it out easy. I used to use just my gloves, and I'll use my hive tool to break the ends of the frames up, and then I'll try to pick it up with my gloves. And I had a lot of honey on my glove at one point, and the end of that frame dropped, and it thud, and man, they come out of there swarming. Even though I'd been in that hive multiple times, they knew who I was. They will recognize you, just like this brother said. They'll pick up on your scent. They'll pick up on your pheromone. If you're nervous and you're anxious, they'll recognize that. If you're relaxed and you're calm and you just move deliberately and gently and slowly, you won't have a minute's trouble. With most hives. Once in a while you got a hive that it's hot, what we call hot, and they're testy and they don't want nobody messing with them. But your hive will get used to you. And oddly enough, I talk to my hives. Girls, how you doing today? Beautiful morning. I want them to hear my voice. I want them to recognize who I am. And some people will think I'm crazy. You can think that, it works. It keeps my happy butt from getting stung. Yes, ma'am.
Would you respond to like music if you were playing music, like soft, nice music out there for them all the time?
I'm sure they would. I've never done that or tried that, and I can't answer that perfectly correct, but I don't see why they wouldn't. I don't know where that would be an issue.
I was going to ask you, do you make
As long as it's not Def Leppard or hip hop.
Fly to the bumblebee.
do you make
Sorry.
new sugar water every time you go in, or
Yes.
do you do?
And here's the reason for it. Sugar water, you have to keep it, once you make it and you let it cool down, if you're not going to use it then, next day, store it in the refrigerator, and it still will, over a period of time, ferment. So when you start to see gray, hazy lines running through it, looks like a cloud, it's bad. And you don't want to spray your bees with that. They won't appreciate that at all.
What's the ratio?
I just use 1-to-1. Some beekeepers, certain times of the year, use a 2-to-1. Too hard for me to remember. I just use 1-to-1 all the time. Yes, sir.
And so do you add Honey Bee Healthy to that sugar water?
Yes, I do.
Spray them with? And there was a product that I was going to ask you about. It's like Pro something, I forget.
Man Lake, I think, makes that product. Yes.
And you would recommend Honey Bee Healthy over that?
So I've never used that product. To answer that correctly, I cannot. I've used Honey Bee Healthy all my life and got along with it beautifully. So I don't fix what's not broke, basically. And I do, from time to time, especially in the spring of the year, when there's so much going on in the hive, I'll use Amino Boost with my Honey Bee Healthy. It's very important that you remember to let your sugar water totally cool down before you put your additives in there. If you add it while it's still hot, it changes the complexion of those oils, and it won't be the attraction that you hope that it will be. So let your sugar water completely cool, then add your Honeybee Healthy and or amino boost. And that's what I use instead of smoking. Yes, ma'am.
Is it best just to have it at room temperature?
Room temperature is great. I try not to use it right out of the refrigerator on my hive because it's cold and yeah.
Hey, Dan,
Yes.
if you get late in the year and you're having to feed your bees, don't put that Honeybee Healthy in there for anything that's going up in that honey super because it tastes terrible.
That is correct, by the way. When you've got honey supers on, so we've got feeders down here where you can feed your bees. Whenever you are these small feeders like this, when you can feed your bees, whenever you've got a honey super on, do not feed your bees. That Honeybee Healthy, I had a good friend who was a young beekeeper, older lady. She had 3 hives. I'd helped her set them up. She left her bee feeders on and put her supers on. She said it was the awfulest tasting honey she ever had. She wound up having to feed it back to the bees. So what you want in your honey supers is pure nectar flow. So do not ever feed. It's okay if you get into your hive to mist them with sugar water. You'll not see any reflection of that in your honey super, but you do not want to feed sugar water with honey. Whenever I've got honey supers on, I don't feed, period. I don't want sugar water in my honey. I want the real McCoy out in the field. I want the real nectar. And they will store that sugar water in those honey cells. So I don't feed at all whenever I'm doing honey, my honey supers up on the bee. Good point. Thank you, Al. Any other questions? Any questions about the forage or what we can do to increase or help that forage?
When do you, I went ahead and bought some pollen patties.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started reading about the things that were not so good about them, like the pests that come with them. When or why would you feed pollen patties?
So I like to feed pollen patties, and Al, you can chime in on this if you have a different thought, but I like to feed pollen patties in the late part of the winter. Sometimes if I've got a hive that doesn't have the honey stores that I feel like it should have, I'll feed them all winter. I'll just put them as a food source in the top of my hive. But specifically and especially in the spring of the year, when that queen starts to lay, I feel like I need to accommodate with some food source. So the brood patties is what I use. The reason I do that is because in February there is very minimal nectar flow and sometimes not much pollen for them to feed that brood with. So the pollen patties kind of helps accommodate that lack of source. So I want to do that, and I've done it with fairly good success. It seems to be helping, and that's the reason I do it. Bear in mind, you can get expensive. You can get really expensive if you're not careful. So you want to, I always try to watch my numbers because I don't want to invest more than I get out of return, especially with my honey that I sell. So all of that weighs in, is all I'm saying. I seen a hand over here somewhere, didn't I? Nope. Okay. So pollen patties are not a bad thing. Yes, sir.
What are the regulations in town for bees?
I don't think Nixa, the city of Nixa, allows bees, do they, in your backyard?
No, they're not supposed to. They're not supposed to have chickens.
Yeah.
I live a mile from here, but I'm in the county. I'm a little segment still in the county.
City limits, I think, in Nixa particularly, I'm not sure about Ozark, but I think Nixa has not yet approved having hives of bees in the city limits. And you have to be really careful with that as far as neighbors and children. That can become a real liability if you're not careful. If you've got neighbors with small kids and they get stung by your bees and one of them has an allergic reaction, you become liable. So you have to be really careful about that. And I tell people that have neighbors close proximity, before you put your bees out in your backyard or on your 5 acres, go talk to your neighbors. Talk to them and tell them, this is what I want to do. Are you okay with that? Would that be all right? And then I take them a pint of honey every once in a while just to keep everything quiet and smooth. Anybody else? Any other questions? I don't think the lady is here. She was here last week. She lived right behind a school and asked me about that. Not a good idea. You know, if you've got a friend or a neighbor that lives kind of out in the country, if you do live in the city and you got a friend or a neighbor that lives kind of out in the country and they don't mind you putting up a hive, that'll be a better option for you. Okay? Okay, any questions about the social order of the hive? We're going to move forward a little bit and talk about some swarming and splitting some hives. And this will be a little bit more of an advanced situation, but this is the time of year when bees start to swarm, so I really want to spend a little bit of time with it because there's nothing wrong with getting a free hive of bees. The swarming process, as we've talked about, what creates the swarming process within the hive, the population level, that the pheromone's not strong enough by the queen to cover all, and their natural tendency is to reproduce themselves. This time of year is when you see swarming take place. Predominantly this time of year. You can see it in midsummer. I don't like to see it. Usually the swarms are really small. This time of the year you'll see massive size swarms. And I've seen some postings on Facebook this last week. Unbelievable how big the swarms are. And I can show you a couple of pictures that I've got on my phone. Huge swarms. These are the best swarms to catch this time of year. When a hive leaves, when a swarm leaves a hive, typically what transpires is the mother queen takes anywhere from 40 to 60%, typically 50 to 60% of the bees, and she'll take them with her. Scout bees will leave the hive initially looking for a place for them to go, ideally looking for them a new home. Sometimes they find it. Most of the time they find and they know where they're going. Sometimes they don't. A lot of beekeepers, and you can talk to Al, he's been real successful with this, Al Markley. He's caught a ton of swarms over the past 5 years with his bee box that he built. You can use a nuke box and bait it. You can use a brood box and bait it. You can use just whatever you want to bait it, and with hopes that they'll go to it. No guarantees, but you hope that you will. And Al has had quite a bit of success being able to get them to go right to his box. But let's talk about, what if you see a swarm out in the wild? What do I do? There's a couple of things to understand. When this queen cell that's going to hatch, when she's at the point of 16 days and she's ready to hatch, she will start making a piping sound that alerts the hive that she's fixing to hatch. That's when the mother queen knows it's time for her to gather her troops and take flight. And they'll typically, tongue-in-cheek, they'll typically take off out of the hive in a fairly close proximity to a tree limb, a fence post, an electrical pole. There's no rhyme or reason to where they land, when they land, or why. The thing that you have to know is before they leave, they will gorge themselves on honey. These bees that are fixing to swarm, they know that they're probably going to be out of a food source for 2 or 3 days, minimal. So they will gorge themselves on honey. They're full, they're fat, they're not going to be hard to contend with. Swarms of bees typically are the most docile stage of bees that you'll find. And you can work with them relatively easy if you don't be over aggressive and make them mad. You can still do that even in swarm stage. When they land, if they land on a limb, more often than not, that's where you'll see them. They're relatively easy to catch. Typically what I do is I'll go up to them, I will take my sugar water and I'll just kind of they'll form in a ball. It might be a long train, it might be spread out, but they'll be pretty close together, and the queen typically is in the heart of that ball. So I'll mist them down a little bit, very lightly on the outside, and if I can take my nuke box or my brood box, I'll take out some frames and I'll put that ball, I'll clip the ends and I'll be as gentle as I can, and I'll just ease it down into that box. I close the box off and leave it overnight. Now you'll be scared to death doing this the first time, but it's a lot of fun. It really is. Once you do the first one, you'll like, geez, that wasn't bad at all. This will be fun. I can tell you some great stories. If you want to hear some great stories, I can tell you some that'll just tickle you to death, because I've had some good experiences with it. But put them down. If you've got a hive ready to go and set up, if your intent is to catch a swarm, then set you up a hive and get it ready at your property. And you can either take that and use it, or you can use a nuke box. I've even used just a regular cardboard box. Anything to catch them and contain them and hold them. You don't want to keep them sealed up too long. They do need some level of air to breathe until you get them to where you're going. But if you put a pinhole in it like this in your box, they'll find it. And once one comes out, they start a train. And then you have bees all over the outside of your box. Mind you that if the queen's inside, they're not going far, but the more that's on the outside, the more confusion it causes for you. So they do need air, and that's why nuke boxes work so well, because they've got the tiny holes that allow that box to breathe. But the main thing is getting the cluster, because typically the queen is in the heart of that cluster. And if you get the queen, you can do anything you want to with that swarm of bees. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
So what do you do after you get them in the box? And
So,
leave them for a little bit?
yes,
and
so-
put them into your hive?
So typically what I would like to have ideally is I'd like to have, and a lot of this depends on the size of the swarm, but I like to have 2 or 3 frames in here with my bait, either pulled out honey frames or some honey or whatever I want to use, or just frames like this misted down with sugar water. I need them to recognize that this is going to be home for them and they're okay being there. Okay? Same with my brood box. If I don't have frames that are drawn out, that have maybe, if you've been in the if you've been in beekeeping for a year or two, you're going to collect some frames that have some honey stores, or they're going to be cells that are drawn out. I mist them down good with sugar water, put them in my box. That way, the next morning when I go in there and they're all over them frames, I know that they've accepted it. When I put that swarm in my box, whichever box it is, I'm going to close it up overnight. I don't want them going nowhere. I want them to adapt to this being their new home. If you get them into this and you close this box up, just remember my caution to you: when you take that cover off the front and allow them, they're going to come rolling out of there. They want their natural order of business is to be foraging and protecting and delivering to this hive. They're going to be a little challenged because you kept them boxed up, but nonetheless, you need them to learn that this is where home is now for them.
Okay, whenever bees swarm, that is the old queen that goes with 50 to 60%.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever they go back into your hive here, is she going to produce another queen since she's so old, or how does that work? I mean,
Typically not. So this is a brand new setup for this swarm. She's going to take position of, this is home for me, this is where I need to go to work, and she'll be okay. Whenever a queen gets to the age that she's not productive, the hive itself will take care of her, and they signal to the hive that she needs to lay a new queen cell, and then they take care of her. But on a swarm situation, typically, once you catch that swarm, you're pretty well established and she'll be set to go.
She's still able to lay enough
Yeah,
larvae to
yeah,
sustain
yeah.
the hive.
Most likely, yes.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
When that happens, the bees that are left in your existing
Mhm.
hive, do they have a queen forming at that time?
Remember, the queen cell is piping now, and the indication to the hive she's going to hatch. And that's when the maiden or the mother queen takes flight.
Now here's another dumb question.
Sure. Not dumb.
We have not opened up our brood box yet because I've been afraid with the weather.
Sure.
So I don't know what's in there. So if I were to put another brood box and something like that did happen, would they swarm into the other brood box?
Possibly. There's no predicting what they'll do when it comes to swarming. They might not. The scout bees might find it and say, oh, this is cool. This is go here. But we can't direct that.
At this time, should I even spray sugar water on another box right now in case that happens?
Here's what I would do in your case. I don't know how much room you have, but I'd take a brood box and set it up directly in front of my existing hive, about 75 yards away. Bait it with your sugar water, or lemongrass oil is a better source.
Like I have essential oils like that,
Lemongrass oil.
and that's what I've got.
Yep. So just take it and roll it on the top of the frames. The scent's what will attract them, and they'll find everything. I mean, if you spray sugar water, my hesitation is you'll attract more than.
Okay.
Yeah. So the lemongrass oil is one of the greatest sources of attractants for the honeybee. But I'd get out there 50 to 75 yards, let it face the direction of the hive initially until they find it, and then if they go to it, then you can move it wherever you want to. And probably I would be hesitant about moving it right beside the other hive for a few days, because this queen, the new queen, needs to get established. Her pheromone needs to begin to dominate that hive. And so when that all is staged, then you can set them side by side and it's great. But initially, I'd give that new queen a little bit of time. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so say I'm new to bees, so I missed the swarm thing and they swarm. So what I have left, that will reestablish itself, right?
Absolutely.
And what if you have like 4 or 5 queen cells? Will the first one come out and just kill the other one?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay.
Typically, the first one and the strongest one, she'll go to the others and she'll slice them open and kill the larva. Mm-hmm. I used to think that I needed to take all the queen cells out but one, and I realized I was making a mistake. Let them determine who the strong one is.
So what if that were to happen in July or something? Would it still repopulate itself enough to make it through the winter?
Well, that's the challenge with you get into July and August. She can repopulate. Actually, the whole challenge is you're going to have a real weak hive, because remember, she's a young queen, so her egg laying process is not mature enough, so her numbers are going to be low. The other challenge is forage. So when I get into July and August and I have that happen, I take one of those steps where I make them do what I want them to do. I'll pull the young queen out and I'll take the bees and integrate them with an existing hive. Because a lot of times they're not going to have time to build to survive. They're going to die through the winter.
Even if you fed them really well? And
You can try that. I mean, it's a roll of the dice and it's a judgment call. So if you feel like you can feed them enough and you want to invest that money to do that, yes. If you're afraid you can't, you don't have time to do that, then blend them back into another hive. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so say you caught your swarm and you close them in the brood box, but that's not where you want them to be. since you're having them closed for 24 hours or overnight anyway, if you just go ahead, it's already closed up, you just go ahead and move it then, or do you just move it then? Okay.
Move it to where you want it to be.
Okay.
While it's closed up.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so say you set up a new hive 75 yards in front, you catch your own swarm. You say leave them there for a while, do you just maybe step them back over to where you want them? Or can you close them up one night after a couple weeks and move them back over? Or should you leave them split?
That's a the old rule of thumb is 2 feet, 2 miles, but if it were mine, I'd let them sit there a couple of days, then I'd close them up one evening and I'd move them where I wanted them to be. You're going to lose a few bees that way. You will lose a few because those worker bees that have gone out will navigate back that direction. But by and large, the risks are greater by moving. It's better to move them than to leave them there. Number one, because they're probably not pointing in the right direction. And number two, it's really just, they're in the way. You know, it doesn't coincide with what you want to establish in your bee yard. So I would probably suffer a little loss and go ahead and move them. Anybody else? If you want to be a swarm catcher, you can actually go to the city and tell them. They get tons of calls about bees. Most people don't understand that swarms are really docile, and their first reaction is get a can of bug spray and kill them. If you'll go to the city, whether it's Nixa, Ozark, or whatever, give them your name and number and tell them that if anybody calls you with a swarm of bees, if you would please call me, I'll be happy to take care of them. They will call you. The challenge is you need to make sure you do take care of them, or they won't call you back, okay? So when I was in swarm catching business, I always had a brood box ready to go in the back of my truck with my equipment in my truck. And if I got a call, I went and I took care of it. It's a lot of fun. It really is a lot of fun because you can almost do whatever you want to do with them. They're so docile at that point. There's still risk of getting stung. You'll get one that's feisty once in a while, but by and large, they're pretty docile. The key is making sure that you get the queen. I've actually got to see, this is a true story, I'll share this with you real quick. We had gone, a buddy of mine and I had gone to Georgia to pick up package bees one year for Nixa Hardware. When you pick up your bees down there, I mean, we had 250 of these packages of bees, and you have to place them where they stay cool, they get the airflow they need, and once you get in that truck to come back home, you keep moving. You can't stop them, stay overnight or anything like that, and it's a 17-hour drive back. We get back at 9 a.m. in the morning, we're exhausted, of course, and we got people coming to buy these bees, pick them up. So we work the bees all day, handing them out. I get a call about 9:30. Lady says, I got a swarm of bees in my backyard. Can you come and get them? And I said, well, I can't right now, but I will this afternoon. They'll be there. Typically when they swarm, there's not a set given time, but a lot of times they'll stay for a 12-hour period, maybe 24 hours. I've not seen them stay much over 2 days, but if they don't know where they're going, they'll stay a little longer. If the scout bees have found them a location, they may light here and an hour later be gone. So that's why it's critical you're ready if you want to catch swarms, because there's no timeline as to predict how long they'll stay in that location. So I said, you know, if they're there at 4:30 this afternoon when I get off, I'll come and get them. If they're not, it's okay. During the middle of the day, about 12:30, it came a monsoon rain. Poured. And I mean, we had water rolling in the streets, and it rained for a good hour and a half. And I thought to myself, these guys will be gone. They won't be there. But I'd done the courteous thing. I pulled over to her house. She lived over in a subdivision. And I said, your bees gone? She said, nope, they're still there. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. She said, no, they're there. All I had, because I had been gone out of town for a couple of days getting these bees, was a cardboard box and a roll of duct tape. They're in the middle of a tomato plant that has this wire ring on it, and they're clustered right in the heart of this tomato plant. And I tell her, I said, you know, I'm going to destroy this tomato plant if I get these bees. I'm happy to replace it if you don't mind. Save the bees. Don't worry about the tomato plant, just save the bees. Well, about this time, her boyfriend steps out on the deck. And I'm like, how am I going to do this? So I take the wire frame off and I set it to the side. And this is a bush tomato plant, so if you're familiar with that, you know they kind of cluster, they don't get real tall. So I take the plant and I pull it up out of the dirt the best I can without disrupting this swarm of bees. Open my cardboard box, and I take this tomato plant and I give it a hard thud right like that to bounce some bees off of it down into this box, and then I start covering up my box. Well, I got bees going everywhere, obviously. So I'm like, well, okay. So I take one end of the flap and I break it down a little bit to where bees can come in, because I got bees on the ground flying all around me looking for the queen. And I pick me up a rock and I start pecking on this box. It's called drumming. And you can do this with the top of your hive. If you want to bring your bees to come to the hive and you've got the queen in there, called drumming. And I started pecking on this box, and these bees started settling, and all these bees on the ground, they just started marching to that hive. And this young guy standing up there on the deck, he said, my God, I never saw nothing like that in my whole life. I mean, it was like an army, and they come up that box and into that lid. It was really pretty. But I said all that to say, you never can predict. If I would have been guessing, and I've been keeping bees for years, I would have guessed by that monsoon rain that they would have taken off and been gone. But they didn't. They stayed the course, and I was able to capture them, and I was able to put them in a hive and gain a hive of bees. And the lady was happy, and I bought her a new tomato plant, and all ended well. It was fun. But the reaction to the guy was the funniest part of this whole thing. He was like, he just didn't think that was even possible. So have fun with it. Again, they'll sense your pheromone, they'll sense your anxiety. Just relax. Assess the best way to capture that swarm. If they're on a limb, I always keep some cutters with me, and you get a hold of that limb on one end, cut it. If you've got somebody with you, it helps a lot to cut the other end. That way it doesn't disturb the swarm ball, and you can ease it down into your box or your hive or whatever you've got. And you'll catch them in the most unlikely places. I've seen them on the side of a fascia of the house, sometimes on the corner of an eave. I've seen them on the bumper of a car. You just, no prediction. Any questions about catching swarms?
Is the probability pretty high if you go next to somebody that has bees and set up
Absolutely.
on the property next
Yep.
to them?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. If they've had bees for 3 or 4 years, typically if they're not proactive with their hives and they don't split them, they're going to swarm. Yes, ma'am.
How would you get them off a wall, like a flat wall?
So I've had that to happen, and what you have to do is actually you take a cardboard box. So you have to pretty much catch them in a box at that point, because your hive body is so heavy it's hard to handle that unless you can get a ladder up there and put your hive right under them on top of that ladder. But I've took a cardboard box and just folded the lid under, stuck it right under them, and take a piece of cardboard and just rake them off in it. And I'm not real ugly with it. I'm pretty gentle with it, but the objective is getting the queen. And typically you can get along with that. You'll have some bees to fly and to get disturbed by it, but if you can catch the hive and the bulk of them, you can catch them. And what you'll see is when you do something like that, even with a limb, when you get the bulk of those bees and you walk away from it, you'll see them bees collect back to that spot because that's where the queen was and her pheromone is still there. So the bees that you didn't catch, that you didn't get in the box, they'll go back and settle right to there. You can go back and try to catch them. Normally the numbers are really small, but sometimes if you feel like you need to get them and you want to get them, get you a second box and go to them.
Now, if that happens, would you be able to set your box down below and do your pecking, and they would come back to the box on the ground?
Depends on how high it is off the ground. But yes, I've seen swarms of bees that actually lit on the ground even. So at that point, if I've got a sheet, I'll get a white sheet and put it in front of my hive and set it on the ground, and I'll start pecking. You know, ideally you want to get the ball, you want to get the queen, but sometimes if you just start pecking, what you're doing is you're imitating the sound of the queen and what she mimics in the hive. Okay? Questions? Okay, let's talk about, let's say you've got an existing hive and you know it's swarm season and you don't want that hive to swarm. What are you going to do? We want to split that hive. So there's a couple of things to bear in mind about splitting the hive. And actually splitting the hive is the safest way to ensure that you don't lose your bees. The natural way is for them to swarm. And a lot of your natural beekeepers will allow their bees to swarm. And here's why. Because it breaks the brood cycle in that hive, it also helps the control of the varroa mite. So the natural beekeepers, because they don't like to use pesticide treatments, they want that hive to swarm because it gives them about a 3-week window of brood break where there's no queen laying brood, which helps the control of the varroa mite cycle. However, if that's not your cup of tea and you want to save and you want the assurance that you're going to maintain that swarm, because there's no predictability once they leave that hive, you cannot predict where they're going to go or how far they're going to go before they light. If you want to ensure that you're going to keep your bees, then you can do what they call splitting the hive. And what that amounts to, there's some key factors that you have to keep in mind. And I think we talked about this a little bit last week, didn't we? You go into the hive, you find the queen cells. I like to get, if I've got a true 2 brood box hive, I've got to check both brood boxes because she may lay some cells in the bottom one as well as the top one. So I got to check both. And it's better if I've got 2 because I've got more to draw from to establish my new hive. Okay? So if I'm going to do this, I've got a couple of options I can do. I can take my nuke box, wherever it went. I can take my nuke box and I can take 5 frames of queen cells out with bees, with brood, with honey stores, and put in this nuke box. That makes it easy for me to transport. If I'm not worried about transporting or the weight of a single brood box, I can do it with a single brood box. And let's say my hive has got 20 frames that are chugged full. It's not impossible. Both the bottom and the top box are full. Now I've got, this gal's prolific. She got 8 frames of brood up here, 6 frames of brood down here. This hive is going to absolutely explode. If I have that scenario, I can pull more than 5 frames out of here and not risk weakening the hive that stays behind. So I can typically, let's say I've got 8 and 6 or some numbers comparatively, I can take theoretically half of that if I wanted to and make sure that in my new hive I've got brood, honey, I see pollen stores, I see honey stores, and I've got all those elements to make up a hive that I can put in my new hive and I'm safe. I would not take over half because you're taking the maiden queen, remember. I'm sorry, you're taking the queen cells. So she has got a period of growth to go through, and this queen that you're leaving behind is really strong. You want her to keep going because you're going to be your productive hive.
So when you pull those 5 out, do you put 5 back in
Yep.
so that queen can keep going?
Yep.
Okay.
If it's 5 new ones like this, mist them down with sugar water and replace them. And I don't know that I would be sporadic in my distribution or in my withdrawal. I wouldn't just take the 5 middle frames. I'd be a little sporadic with that. The important thing is you have to make sure that you do not leave a queen cell in this existing hive. If you're pulling all of the queen cells and putting them in your new hive, do not leave if you have more frames than you need and you still got queen cells, cut them off and throw them away. There cannot be any queen cells left because you know what's going to happen. She's going to hatch and that hive's going to swarm again, and you've weakened it to the point where probably neither one of them will survive it. I've seen a question mark somewhere. Maybe I'd answered it. Yeah.
You talked about putting them in the nuke box.
Uh-huh.
Why? Why would you put them in the nuke box versus another brood box?
So only for transport person.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Some people, if you don't get a full 5 frames, some people will put them in there and just let the queen hatch. But if you've got 5 full frames, you've got a full box, what's going to happen? You got your room. So just for transporting. And when you put them in this box, there's a front opening here that lifts up like that, and you close it. If you're transporting them, close it. Okay? Same with a brood box. The ideal situation is to be able to put them in a new brood box. Now, the old timers will tell you, and we talked about this last week, when you do this, you need to take that new hive. They'll tell you 2 miles. I've gotten away with it at 1/4 mile, but they need to, because the queen's pheromone is so critical to that hive, they need to be separated until the new queen can establish her pheromone in that existing hive. Once that happens, then you'll be fine and you'll be safe.
How long does that take to establish that?
So let's talk about that. When that queen hatches, let's talk about what transpires there, because there's where the risk is involved. It takes that queen, that new queen, it'll take her 2 or 3 days to kind of get her legs under her. They'll groom her. She needs a little strength. Her first mission is that maiden flight. That's a little risky. And that's where the challenge, and you have to really watch this new hive because she can get caught by a bird. You know, there's a lot of pests out there that feed on the honeybee, or the bird is the biggest risk. She will fly to a drone field, an area where the drones congregate. They have coffee every morning, la-di-da-di-da. I'm just kidding. But they call it a drone field, and that is where she will get bred by possibly as many as 15 to 20 drones before she comes back. By the way, when a drone breeds a queen, he dies. His life is over. There's really a dramatic scenario that I could describe, but I won't. But death is imminent for him after he has done his job with the queen. So she will be bred by as many as could be 12, 15, maybe even 20 drones, and then she comes back to the hive and she starts her laying process. It is a process because she's young, she's learning what to do, where to do it, how to do it. It takes some time for her to get her feet under her and really get to be what we call a prolific queen. And it can take up to a year. So that new hive is going to be relatively weaker, the weaker of the 2 hives. Did that answer your question?
Well, what I was thinking was, like, if you're splitting the hive and you're taking it off, 1/4 to 2 miles away, how long does it take for that queen to establish her scent for that new hive?
I would give her at least a week to 10 days. Mm-hmm.
Can you move it in after that time?
Yes.
Back to your
Yes.
hive yard?
Yes.
And how frequently is the queen fertilized? Is it just
So the books will tell you one time, but I know a couple of older beekeepers, gentlemen that have been keeping bees years, they think and they believe that that queen will revisit a drone field in a couple of years. So scientifically, the books say once, but I tell you what I know. Any other questions?
So how does she know where this drone field is?
Just part of their communication process.
Okay.
Now, that's where the risk is with the bee, with the queen. She can get caught. She can have problems in her flight. If she doesn't never make it back, you've got a queenless hive. So you have to watch those kind of things. You have to keep inspecting that hive to make sure that your queen has made it back. And once you can recognize that or sense that, then everything should proceed as normal. Understanding and knowing that there is a timeline. I mean, it's going to take her probably 3 weeks to really get her legs under her and begin to become somewhat productive in her mission as a queen. So they'll tell you, give her 3 weeks to be prominent there. Now, let's talk about something else. What if we reversed the style or the design of our split? What if we took the risk, tried to minimize it? It really won't minimize it, Dan. So I was thinking if we took the original queen out of the hive, that new queen has still got to take her maiden flight, and she's still got, so it doesn't matter. Whether you take the queen cells out of the hive or you capture the maiden queen and take her out of the hive, the actual mode of the natural swarming process would be to take the original queen out and half of the hive. That's what they're going to do if you do nothing with them. So that's the natural process. The mother queen leaves the hive, the existing queen cells stay and take over the hive. You can do whichever direction you're most comfortable with.
Can you buy a queen and remove the mother queen and then add a new queen?
If you need to, you can.
It's not recommended though?
Well, it depends on how well your mother queen's doing.
Yeah.
If she's doing a good job, there's no reason for that. If you're not happy with her, yes, you can remove her out of the hive and let that hive set queenless a minimum of 3 days. So her pheromone dissipates before you introduce a new queen. And ideally, I like 5 days because at 5 days, her pheromones has dissipated, and by the 5th day, they're getting a little hungry for a queen.
Yeah.
So they're readily willing to accept more likely a new queen. And you can tell when you put a new queen in how their behaviors is, whether they're accepting her or not. If they're trying to groom her and feed her in that queen cell, when I put a new queen in my hive, I never take her out of the box she comes in. They come designed with hard rock candy in the end. They come designed with the worker bees to eat that candy out. The theory is by the time they eat that out, they'll have accepted her and she can escape and come out. That doesn't always work. So I tape that up so they can't get to it, and I put her in there and I leave her until I'm satisfied that they've accepted her. They're trying to feed her, groom her, trying to help her. Then I personally will release her. Yeah. Just because a queen costs you $25 to $50, depending on what you buy, I want to minimize the risk as much as I can. Because I have had them literally had that happen. I walked through that step, and then when I went to release her and I peeled back that screen, she took off. Made me sick. And she was a $100 queen.
Hold her down in
Yep.
the frame.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I looked for 3
Are they
hours.
Overnight, I mean, when you order, do they ship them FedEx generally overnight?
Very good question. So if you order a queen and you get into a point where you're got a queenless hive and you need a queen, when you call the apiary, they'll give you an idea of what date it'll arrive. They'll ship it U.S. mail. The U.S. mail does not know what to do with queens. They don't want to do with queens. So I tell people, call your post office and tell them that you have a live honeybee queen coming. Please call me when it gets here. I'll come and get it. If you live on a rural route, you don't want your queen sitting in a hot car until it gets to your mailbox. So when they call you, then I go to the post office and I pick my queen up. She ideally needs to stay a little bit cooler because she'll stay more docile, and they will have nurse attendant bees in that box with her to feed her and to take care of her. And the hotter it is, the more frustrated they'll get. So I usually try to keep them on the cooler side. They stay more docile that way. And I don't want my mail carrier carrying her around for a whole day, especially in July and August.
When you order a queen, has she already taken her maiden flight, or when you get her, she'll have to do all
No,
that?
she should be ready to go.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And you said leave her in the box until you released her, but how long is that on average?
Depends on how long my box has been queenless, but typically 2 to 3 days at the most. Some hives will really readily accept her. Some hives, if they're not ready to accept her, they'll be pretty aggressive with that box. I mean, she's protected, and if your queen comes in and she's dead, you call the apiary, they'll replace her. Call them immediately because you've got a timeline that you need to work with. I don't want my hive queenless over 10 days because then they become, and you can tell when a hive is queenless if you've got hives in your yard and that one of them becomes queenless. One of the first things I do when I go to my hive is I look at the front of my hive. I'll just stand back and watch the activity. If they're in and out of there, like it's Chicago O'Hare International Airport, they're busy, they're working, I'm comfortable, I've probably got a queen in there. If they're just milling around and they're acting like they don't know what they're doing, I've got a problem. So you open that hive and the bees are just kind of milling around and they look aimless and lost. It's because they have no direction. They've lost their queen. And that's when I have to do my work. I have to make sure that they don't have a queen. I have to look and make sure that I don't have a queen before I replace her. If I put a queen in there with an existing queen, I've got complications that way. So they'll get real listless, they'll get aimless. By about 7-8 days, you'll see that they have no direction as a hive. So I don't like for them to go over 10 days if I can help it at all.
If you're in that situation and you have multiple hives and one of them goes queenless and you have queen cells in another hive, could you transfer it over and would they take it from there?
You can try that, yes. So if I did that, I would make sure that I took that frame and that I misted it down with sugar water really well, not drowning well, but really well. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to mask that pheromone from that existing hive. But yes, you can try that. The challenge with it is twofold. Number one, I would take all the bees off of that hive. I'd shake them off. And I usually go, because I work from behind, I'll just take that frame and I'll just bounce it pretty hard with my hands. They'll hit the ground in the grass, that's fine. And then I mist it down really good with sugar water. The challenge is the existing hive accepting it. It's a little bit of a gamble, but it would be worth the effort. Especially if your existing hive's got multiple there.
Supposedly, if you mix that honeybee healthy in there, it helps mask that.
It does. It does. The camellia oil, the lemongrass oil, it helps mask all that oil, all that pheromone. Any other questions? We get into some pretty detailed stuff today, but this is stuff that you down the road as you get into, you'll kind of recollect it and kind of remember it, and it'll help you, hopefully. Any other questions on splitting the hives? Yes.
If you split the hive and you decide to go like the natural route of taking the actual mother queen, you still move it a quarter-mile or so away?
You do, and the reason is because her pheromones is still existent, so them bees might navigate back to that. So I don't want that to happen if I can help it. And like I say, the closest proximity I've ever been able to get away with has been a quarter of a mile or so. And a lot of that will depend on where the forage is and if they're working, all of those things. If you can take it away a couple of miles, you got a friend that's out of town and they can just set it there for a couple of weeks, that works great. Helps you a lot. And the hive won't be a problem to your friend. Any other questions? So let's open the floor and any questions at all that you have for me. I basically have given you everything that I have for today. Next week we're going to talk about pest management. It'll be a little lengthy, probably not 3 hours lengthy, but it'll be a little lengthy. Any particular questions? Broad spectrum, over the board. Yes, sir.
Yeah, kind of back to the extracting one from a tree.
Sure.
You talk a lot about temperature. It seems like it's a pretty fine balance between being hot, where they're going to be more aggressive, being cool, but not too cool. So would a day like today be a good day to do that?
Today's pretty cool. So what I'm noticing now is Arkansas is seeing a lot of swarming going on. Missouri is not yet. Have you heard of anybody swarming?
Got one in Rogersville.
Yep.
Monday or Tuesday.
Yep. It's really minimal here because it just hasn't warmed up enough. What I'm afraid is going to happen when this cool breaks, it's going to turn off pretty warm and it's going to explode. So if you want to catch swarms, get ready.
What do you recommend for making a trap to get going on catching swarms?
A nuke box will work okay, or you can use one of these, or go see Al. Al's got a great trap idea that works really well. He might share some thoughts and glean some thoughts from him with it as well.
Are these water resistant?
They are.
Okay.
Yeah, they are. Yes, ma'am. Behind you.
So if you just had a spare, could you just set it up and see if you could catch a swarm?
They tell you ideally the best height to set one is about 15 feet, 12 to 15 feet. So if you've got a tree that's got a fork situation, you can kind of get that point in the right direction as far as south-southeast. I mean, that's an ideal configuration. And you can get it up there, you can strap it to the tree. That's what would be your best opportunity for catching a swarm. Yes, ma'am.
How long can they actually stay in the nuke box instead of like the brood box?
If you've got new frames in it, you can give them some ideal time because they've got to build their home. They're not hurting for room.
Like whenever you're like moving them like a quarter down the way or something, could you actually leave them in there for like the whole 10 days that you're?
If I had 5 full frames, I'd not. No. Okay. I need to make sure they've got room. Give them plenty of room. Now, I have seen situations where the swarm was so big that one box wasn't enough. If you call Loretta Klosky, she will tell you, we caught a hive. I helped her catch a hive a couple of years ago, put them in a box, big hive. They left. Went to a tree, she found them. She called me, she said, they didn't stay in my box. And I said, are they where you can? Yeah, my husband will help me get up there and get them. I said, put a second brood box on it. They don't have enough room. It's too big a swarm. You kidding? I said, no. She put the second box on, put them in, they stayed. So if there's that kind of numbers, and this time of year you have that chance, because you'll have your best swarms the next 30 days. When it warms up, the numbers can be big. If it's that big, you may need 2 boxes on it. The trick to that is making sure they fill out both boxes, because her natural inclination is going to want to go to the top. She'll fill this box out first. Then what are you going to do?
You're
Good idea. So once she's done that, I can flip these two and force her to come up to fill out the second box. But once in a while, like the picture I saw in Northwest Arkansas this morning on Facebook, this swarm was every bit that long and probably that big around. One box is not going to hold that number of bees. So it's very possible this time of year out of the gate, especially with it being as cool as it's been, and they're stuffed in these boxes. They're not flying, they're not swarming while it's this cool, but they're still growing because these eggs are still hatching. So we very well may see some huge swarms in the next 30 days. And they'll be the best swarms of the season. The longer you go into the summer, the smaller they'll get. Questions? Yes, sir.
So in the winter, I mean, it's cold, so you're not opening them up. How do you know what's going on with your hive and making sure everything's good?
So when I button my hives down in November, and when I say I button them down, I give them their final dose of Honeybee Healthy. If the hive's not as strong as I feel like it should be, I'll put brood patties on them. When I close them down, I'm done. Now I might, when you get a warm day, the thing to understand about the honeybee is they will not defecate in the hive. They will not soil their own hive. So we get a warm day in the spring or in December or January, your bees are flying, you see, oh, this is great. They're out taking cleansing flights and defecating. The danger that I worry about in my months that I'm most concerned about is February, March, because there's so much that starts happening. So and I actually own a stethoscope, and I can take it and go to the side of that box and I can hear them inside the hive if I'm that concerned. February, March are the 2 months you need to watch, because if they overwinter, they can run out of honey source inside the hive. There's nothing on the outside. Typically, it's not warm enough, and you've got a queen that's really starting to take care of business and starting to lay. So brood is becoming a real critical issue. So that's when we really need to watch. I really try to make sure that in February and March, if I'm going to do brood patties, I've got them in there then. And if I have the opportunity to feed, I do then. Sugar water rarely will freeze at 1-to-1 ratio. And I've got these boxes are designed to set on, easy Scooter. These boxes are designed to set on top of your hive, and you can put up to 4 gallons of sugar water in this one, and they come up the middle. The slat boards float so that the bees don't the risk of drowning is minimized. So, and they work great.
I do have a question about that, because I did buy one of those for this last winter, and I had a beekeeper tell me not to do the water, to just put sugar in there.
So some beekeepers do just put sugar in the hive. In Michigan, remember we talked last week about how they do things different? They will actually pour 5 pounds of sugar granules in the top of their hive before they close it up. The challenge that I have with that, and the only thing that I see that concerns me with that, is they need a water source. They need some level of liquidation. So if it's too cold for them to go out and get it, where are they going to get it from? But it apparently works and works fine. I've never done it. And you want to use pure cane sugar, C&H. Do not use raw sugar, and don't use any artificial sweeteners.
Can you talk more about fattening them up?
Sure.
You know, like we had the,
Yeah.
They gotta get in and out, right?
Yes, so my buttoning up process is just a matter, I want to inspect my hive in November. I want to see what kind of honey stores I've got. And if I feel like there's enough, adequate enough for them to survive through the winter. If they don't have what I feel like they need, then I know I've got to supplement, okay? So that's a judgment call that I have to make as a beekeeper with my hive, and I err on the side of caution more than I do the side of risk. I don't. You pay good money for this hive, pay good money for this equipment. It's of no value with no bees in there. So I have a tendency to err on the side of caution a little more. And if I'm overprotective or overfeeding, so be it. Okay. Other than that, I put an entrance reducer on just to slow down. This is my summer entrance reducer if I'm going to use it. This is my winter. So I will put my winter entrance reducer on there, and kind of that's the extent of my closing up my hive. I have screen tops. I don't take that off because I don't want moisture to build up, because they will heat this by fanning it. They'll create their own heat to keep the hive warm. The honey stores that are in there acts like insulation blankets. They hold heat, so they're in good order. When it's 20 below zero, my bees are still in pretty good order most of the time, if they're a good healthy hive. Okay.
Do you put anything in the top screen, like the wood shavings or something, to help for insulation?
Nope.
Okay.
Nope. One thing that I don't want to do, and every beekeeper is different, and knock on wood, I've had very few hives that I've lost to freezing, to cold. I've lost a few to starvation because I wasn't cautious enough. But freezing, now I've talked to people all the time that do lose hives to freezing. If they're, if they're stuck in a ball and there's no life there, they have froze. So if their heads are stuck in the cell and they're dead, they've starved. But what I've discovered is if I don't wrap my blanket, I don't do any of that. I don't want to disguise the ambient temperature outside, because if they come out and I've got this wrapped up and they think it's warmer outside than what it is, when they hit the landing board, it's over if it's 43 degrees or less.
On your entrance thing there, they're going to close that little bitty gap. They're going to close that up?
Nope.
No, I don't mean the hole. I mean the gap between the brood box.
Oh, they might propolis
that
it.
horizontal straight line there.
They might propolis it.
Okay.
But I doubt it.
But you always leave that hole open.
This little hole, this entrance hole. Yes.
Even in the dead of winter, you're going to leave that open.
I want some airflow. They got to have airflow.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just remember how cold it was this winter.
Yep. But they've still got to have airflow. Now, and listen, you got to realize that this size of an opening is very restrictive with airflow. It's not like if that was out. Whew. So you're really restricting the airflow, but the key is they are getting air and they have to have it. They have to have an amount of air to keep from moisture from building up in here and mold. If it moistures and molds, they're leaving.
Right.
So you've got to have some level of airflow.
So that box that you were showing that you put the sugar water, it goes.
I put it right on my top box if I'm going to use it.
Put your screen and then your lid. Okay.
Yep.
Would you use that for winter?
You can. Yeah, it won't freeze.
When you said that the ratio of sugar water is 1-to-1, is that by volume or by weight?
Volume.
Cup of water, cup of sugar.
So volume.
Yeah.
And are you using that every winter?
Nope.
Okay, so you don't do that every winter.
Only if I have a weak hive.
Okay.
If my hive is good and strong and I see good honey stores, no.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
The mouse guards, should you put them on in the fall? Because I know mice tend to like find warm spots.
Yeah, if you have a problem or you have a concern, yes, you can.
Now, are they, I've not seen them over there, are they just a piece of like rabbit wire?
No, actually they are, they'll be this length. They're kind of a dark green. They'll look like an L shape and they've got holes in them. You don't have mouse guards over there, Al?
Yeah, we do, and we've got another guard over there that, it's got, queen, like a queen excluder rack in front. And I like that because I know last year we had, several people lost it to European hornets. And that'll keep the European hornets out.
Yeah, yeah. So yes. Now, you see this year I've changed my bottom board this time. They didn't build this one right, but this slat should not be on this bottom. In an ideal world, you would flip that bottom board to where your entrance open wasn't this deep, but it would be more shallower. Okay? I don't know, whoever put this together shouldn't have put that strip on there. But if it were mine, I'd take it off. That way I've got a little shallower. Or if you've got, no, I see why they've done it now, because I've got these thick spacers. You also have this style of spacer. This come with the bottom board, so it's designed and cut to fit right in there like this. Let me turn this over the right way. So it's designed to do that. You'll have to make sure, I want to make sure that that stays in place. So if I have to tack it, nail tack it or something like that to make sure it's stationary, then I do. Okay.
When you get your hives and set them up and put that strip in there, because maybe in the spring you feel like it's a little cool. Last year I had 2 people that kept it on that small opening and asked me in July why their hives weren't building up. Well, the bees couldn't get in and out.
Right.
And pull that thing off.
Yeah. Yeah. And I trust my bees to take care of themselves. So I've had winters when I didn't even put that strip in. And bees done just fine. And a lot of it is determined by the strength of your hive. You will know as you experience this whether you have a weak hive or a strong hive. You'll know as you go through season. You'll know by what goes on in the fall. You'll recognize that, and as you recognize those elements, that helps you to assess the best way to handle that particular hive. And let me tell you this, you can have 6 hives side by side in your bee yard, and every one of those hives will be different. Every one of them will have their own temperament, they'll have their own personality, they'll have their own work ethic. They will be different, and you will learn each hive as they produce and how they work and how they do. You may get one that don't like you messing with them at all. Queen's a little testy. You'll get one that they could care less if the hive was open all the time or not. They're still going to do what they know to do. So you'll recognize personality traits. They will recognize you as you, the more you work with them. And again, every time you open that hive, you kind of disrupt the social order of that hive. So be wise with your interactions with your hive. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Is it best not to check your hives on the same day then? If you have, or
Doesn't really matter. I'm just cautious about, some teachers will tell you every week you got to be there. I don't subscribe to that. It depends on the time of the year. The one particular beekeeper instructor that I'm thinking of that advocates that is a commercial beekeeper, and yes, his needs are different than our needs are. So the time of the year is the critical piece. If you get into spring and this hive is exploding, every week may be necessary. If it's not, then 10 days, 2 weeks, and when I get into midsummer, less than that. Okay? As long as I see good activity going on with my hive. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
So going into winter, what does good honey stores look like on a hive this size?
So ideally, I would like to see at least my outside frames, 2 to 3 on each side, particularly 2 frames on each side with honey stores. And if they've had a good year, they'll chug that frame full. The last frame to get filled out in a box is the outside frames. And typically, if this was my frame inside the box, this side would be the last one to get filled out. Once in a while, I get a little bit manipulative, and I'll get in there and I'll scoot that empty frame over a little bit and kind of force their hand to it. So I make sure that when I get to winter, I've got 2 solid frames of honey on each side. I feel pretty comfortable with that, especially if I've got 2 boxes worth. So 4 full frames of honey with a small ball of bees, I should be okay at least till I get to the end of January, into February.
And whenever they put the honey on the outside, is that a design thing because it's kind of out of the way and that's where they want it, and also because of insulation, or is the insulation kind of not?
Just the nature of the beast, more than anything.
It's kind of interesting that they put it like that.
Yeah.
It kind of helps them keep it heated.
Yeah. So a lot of beekeepers, and I'm going to stress this to you as well, when you have a hive full of frames, I don't mix the order of those frames, with the exception of maybe my honey frames. The brood frames, I don't want to exchange or move from different places. I want to keep the order correct. If I have a honey frame that's not filled out like I'd like for it to be, I'll leave it the same direction. I may scoot it in one and force them to it a little more so they'll fill it out before winter gets here. But the brood frames, I don't manipulate. I don't move them at all. So anytime I'm inspecting my hive and I pull frames out, I want to make sure I get the order correct. And I have people that even number their frames 1 through 10 so they can make sure they do that correctly. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
Do you take the supers off then in the winter?
If I have a strong hive that I know is going to be okay for the winter, yes. If I have a weak hive that I have honey stores in my super and I don't need the honey, I'll leave it for a food source for them. You just have to assess your hive when you get into October. That's when I also do my treatment plan. So I have opportunity to assess them. And you'll learn as you go what equates to a strong hive and what equates to a weaker hive. I've seen hives fill out supers in 3 weeks. It's a good strong hive. When they can do 10 medium frames, they have a good forage source and they're a good strong hive. 3 weeks. And then I've seen them go all summer and not get it filled up. So, you just have to assess the quality and the strength of your hive. Anybody else? Yes.
How do you work the bottom brood box whenever you've got the potential of having bees up in the top one? I mean, how do you?
Very carefully. Yeah. You can. So what I have found is if I'm working the top box, they don't get too bothered by that. I mean, they might get a little fussy with me and buzz me once in a while. When I take that box off to get to this bottom box, it kind of changes the complexion of things. They really don't appreciate that. A lot of times I'm okay. So ideally what I'll do is I'll take my lid and I'll turn it upside down and I'll peel this box off after I'm done working it. You have to break the corners loose, lift it off. If it's full, it's about 90 pounds. You got to be ready for that. And then I set it at an angle across my top box because I'm going to have bees down here. I don't want to kill any more than I have to. So I set it twisted and just let it rest on that. And then I start working this box. And I work quickly, as best I can. Same with, you get into a situation where you need to flip these boxes. Some beekeepers will tell you every spring you need to flip them. They'll overwinter up here. That's where most of their food sources will be. When you inspect out of the gate in the spring, you'll need to look at that bottom box. If it's empty, it needs to come to the top. You need to flip them. And that's okay. You won't disrupt your hive by doing that. You actually are serving them better by doing that because, let me step back a step. When I'm assessing this hive, if they're in the top box and this top box is not